Remember our last On Location episode? You should, it was the last video on this channel. I said the next video, this one, would be rather different as far as the location. We loaded up the family car and took it to Colorado. While we won't be doing too much traditional rail fanning, Colorado is rich in railroad history and we'll be exploring a bit of that. I-80 in Nebraska also runs adjacent to UP's famous Overland route, which boasts traffic numbers that sound ridiculous to most of us. We really pick up our story on Saturday. After stopping in Coralville, Iowa for Friday night, I catch wind that Iowa Interstate will be running a steam excursion from Newton, Iowa to Bureau, Illinois and back. Unfortunately, I don't have time to wait around, which is really unfortunate because my hotel room directly faces the Iowa Interstate tracks. But we have bigger rail plans for the day. In the West, if you're looking at a railroad, there's about a 97% chance it's owned either by BNSF or Union Pacific, and if one owns it, the other might have trackage rights over it. Without the frequent curves and towns we have here in Illinois, trains can really open up out here. On the UP Kearney sub that runs between Grand Island and North Platte, the maximum timetable speed for freights is 70 miles an hour. The entirety of this 138-mile subdivision is double track, with 107 of it triple track. Speaking of North Platte, we come to our first stop. North Platte was founded by the railroad and at one point was where UP ended. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869 when the Union Pacific met the Central Pacific in Utah, and while this was where West met East in the greater context, North Platte was where West met East for the Union Pacific. Given its location in the middle of the original UP system, it became and remains a major facility on the system. Adjacent to the yard is the Golden Spike Tower, an attraction that gets you 8 floors above the yard for a bird's eye view of Bailey Yard, the largest classification yard in the world. According to the tower, the yard handles 14,000 rail cars every day. On average, 139 trains per day move into, out of, or through the yard. It also has a large engine facility. Mainline movements are all controlled out of Omaha, like all UP lines, but Bailey Yard has its own command center on site, so we headed up to the tower. It's impossible to see the entire yard from one spot as it stretches for 8 miles. From the tower, you have an excellent view of both humps, the mains, and the engine facility. Although some railroads are converting their humps to flat switching, Bailey Yard still heavily uses both their humps. Of course, there's also flat switching, largely done now by remote control locomotives.
Right, they get to the end of that, and then they just, by gravity, just...
Going on the other side.
Yeah, go for it.
Unlike engine facilities near Chicago that often get lots of transfer power, the engine facility here is a sea of UP yellow. Wind can often be a problem here as it's the Great Plains, but here's a look to the east. An eastbound grain train pulls in as a stack train paces it in the background.
So we got one more and see what the big deck up there looks like.
Remote control engines are everywhere here, allowing one-man crews on the switchers. Back to the windy side, a westbound autorack train pulls into a stop. I know this video is hard to watch because of how shaky it is, but it was extremely windy. Back to the sheltered side, a yard engine pushes sets of gondolas over the hump. Up on the 9th floor, which is enclosed, there are more displays talking about the yard, and a former employee is on hand to answer any questions you may have and tell stories of what it was like to work for the railroad. I didn't get much video here because the original plan was to stop back here on the way home. However, horrible weather changed this plan. Maybe someday I'll be able to get back here.
It's all the states where they are. Okay, that makes sense.
Heading west into Colorado, we run along the BNSF brush sub from about Fort Morgan to Denver. This line hosts Amtrak's California Zephyr, which did not have a stellar week of on-time performance while we were there, and I was never able to get video or even a picture of. Sunday was a railroad-free day, while Monday was not. On Monday, we headed down to Colorado Springs and the Manitou Incline. This is a former incline railroad turned part fitness challenge, part trail that rises 2,000 feet in only 0.88 miles and peaks at... yeah, you know we didn't actually do that. Instead, we're taking the immediately adjacent Pikes Peak Cog Railway. This is only one of 3 cog railways in the U.S. and runs all the way to the summit of Pikes Peak. The temperature at the base of the mountain was in the upper 70s, but the weather on the summit was a very windy 38 degrees. With the wind came smoke from wildfires in Arizona, severely hindering the visibility. So I didn't really get a whole lot of video from here. My GoPro was in my pocket, but when you're 6'4", the cars are extremely cramped, and it was difficult to pull it out to get any video. And yes, up that high, even in the middle of June, there's still snow. No. On Tuesday, we took the short trek west over to Georgetown and rode the Georgetown Loop Railroad. Built by the Georgetown, Breckenridge, and Leadville, and opening in 1884, it served the towns of Georgetown and Silver Plume through the Colorado Silver Rush, and would eventually be taken over by the Colorado and Southern until 1938. The line would shut down in 1939 and be removed, but in 1973 the line was rebuilt with assistance from Union Pacific, who donated track and ties. A former mine sits in the middle, which can be toured, but we didn't opt to do that.
layover where a locomotive gets a 500-gallon drink of water. hillside, and if you notice a pile of gray material.
Wednesday was another train-free day that we spent in Rocky Mountain National Park. However, Thursday we went all in. The Colorado Railroad Museum in Golden features a who's who of Colorado railroading, both standard and narrow gauge. Admission is a very reasonable $10, with train rides costing a measly $4 more for 3 laps around the museum grounds.
Colorado, as well as information on the standard gauge railroads that ran in Colorado. As we move up the hill on the inside loop here, you'll see a black steam engine. It's the Manitou and Pike Street Top Railway engine that ran from the late 1800s up until even 1960. Also up on the hill here, you'll see another piece of equipment from the Manitou and Pike Street Top Railway. It's car number 7. It was a passenger car with an engine there, and it was powered by a Cadillac automobile engine. On the inside of the loop here, this is when the power is transferred to the wheels through gears, and the power goes up and down. The cylinders go up and down versus horizontal on normal steam. They were used in very harsh environments to haul heavy loads up steep hills. On the inside of the track here, you'll see some of our vintage equipment. The middle car here, number 284, is over 150 years old. It's real gorgeous. On the inside of the loop here, you'll see our opener cars, which we use in the summer and fall for various excursions. Also on the inside of the loop, you'll see our roundhouse. It has 5 stalls. Normally stall number 1 is 491. The largest operating steam engine in Colorado, narrow gauge steam engine, stall number 1 in the stall. We've also got 346 and stall number 2, I believe, to work up as well. Notice all the little kids down here moving the turntable. That's an Armstrong turntable, weighs 55 tons, and those 2 little kids can actually move it on their own. Inside the track here, if you look up here, you'll see engine 683. That was the last standard gauge steam engine to run on the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad. If you look on the inside of the loop here, up on the hill, you'll see a red switcher engine that Coors donated to us after it had an accident.
In addition to the rides, the museum currently has a large display of Pullman artifacts and a large HO scale model railroad in the basement, and a garden railway outside. You can walk into a couple of Union Pacific passenger cars, one a dining car and one a coach. There are these 2 former Rio Grande F units that once pulled the Rio Grande Zephyr between Denver and Ogden, Utah. The original California Zephyr was a joint train between the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, Rio Grande, and Western Pacific. Western Pacific discontinued their section in 1970. Amtrak originally planned to reinstate the entire route in 1971, but Amtrak and the Rio Grande couldn't come to terms with a contract, and the California Zephyr was instead routed via the overland route as the San Francisco Zephyr. The Rio Grande would continue operating the Rio Grande Zephyr until 1983, when it finally joined Amtrak, and the train was rerouted to the originally preferred route it uses today, with the California Zephyr name restored. The turntable, which still functions, features several different locomotives from famous railroads such as the Rio Grande Southern, not to be confused with the Denver and Rio Grande Western that was a common merge target and eventually merged with Southern Pacific. Some of the more interesting pieces from the Rio Grande Southern are the galloping geese. These were born out of a problem during the Great Depression. The railroad had a contract to deliver U.S. mail, but the Depression had hit the railroad hard and they couldn't afford to pay employees to operate the locomotives, much less run trains. In 1931, a mechanic for the railroad built a Frankenstein rail car from an old Buick. They were significantly cheaper to operate and lighter, reducing wear on the already poor track bed. This solution worked, allowing the Rio Grande Southern to fulfill their mail contracts. Regular freight runs would eventually resume until 1952, when failure to clear snow to deliver the mail saw their contract get lost, but the geese remained mainstays on the line, used for just about anything. Almost all traces of the railroad were removed after abandonment, although some equipment remains in museums like this one. 7 geese in total were built between 1931 and 1936, and 6 survive. The first one was scrapped, although a replica was built in 2000. The Colorado Railroad Museum has 3 of them. Another piece of Western railroading is this Rio Grande SD40T-2. These locomotives, which functionally are identical to regular and significantly more common SD40-2, are different in a few ways. The biggest and most noticeable difference is the location of their air intakes for the radiators. For Western railroads, especially the Rio Grande and Southern Pacific, tunnels were a regular way of life. The problem was that the diesel locomotives often had their cooling systems up high on the locomotive body. Tunnels would trap the hot exhaust from the engines, causing overheating problems. The solution was to modify the cooling system of the locomotive to be lower on the body, below the level of the hot exhaust. Here you can see the intake grate low on the body on Rio Grande 5401. 5401 was beautifully restored by the museum to Rio Grande paint after it was donated by Union Pacific in 2018. On Friday, we started heading back home, running again along the BNSF and UP through eastern Colorado and Nebraska. The last day of the trip, we stayed in Iowa City, and in the morning I heard an Iowa interstate freight passing by, but of course didn't see it. Although the mainline rail action may not be as widespread as back home, the tourist and historic railroads are second to none in Colorado. I highly recommend stopping in North Platte as you can, as there's almost always something going on in Bailey Yard. I also highly recommend the Georgetown Loop. It's a little bit of a drive from Denver, but it's worth it. The Pikes Peak Cog Railway is a little more expensive, but the view can't be beat, and it is much faster than driving it. Just be warned that you won't have a whole lot of time at the summit before your return trip. I had enough time to get food, eat it, and take a few pictures, but that's about it. We're a bit spoiled here in Illinois with the absolutely massive Illinois Railway Museum, but the Colorado Railroad Museum is very affordably priced and has a good selection of equipment and exhibits jammed into a relatively small property. Thanks for coming along on this little trip west. I'll be posting more pictures from the trip on my Instagram periodically at NEILRailFan, and you can read my blog at thenortheasternillinoisrailfan.wordpress.com, links to both in the description. More than likely, the next video won't be quite as exotic as this one. But until then, stay safe, get out and explore when you can, and thank you for watching the Northeastern Illinois Railfan YouTube channel.